All of this is to say, Danny, to put it very simply, we're screwed.
2 words from a man who has been right about every major American foreign policy disaster for the last 30 years.
I could go through this and lay out all the reasons that this is an unequivocal defeat. This is going to go down in the history books as the greatest foreign policy blunder that the United States has ever made. The Iraq War in 2003 now occupies that place in the historical record, but this one will easily supplant the Iraq War.
Greater than Iraq, greater than Vietnam, greater than anything. Welcome back to ARM Geopolitics. I'm Aaron Johnson, and on this channel, we don't just cover the news. We cut through the noise, dominate the narrative, and give you the analysis mainstream media is too scared to run. Vigilance is our shield, truth is our weapon. Let's get into it. I've watched a lot of analysis on this war, hours of it. Most of it I could predict before the person finished their sentence. Then I watched this conversation, and there were 2 or 3 moments where I had to stop, rewind, and just sit with what he said. Not because it was shocking for shock's sake, but because once you hear it laid out that clearly, with that much evidence behind it, you can't really argue your way out of it. John Mearsheimer, he called Iraq before the invasion. He called Ukraine before it started. And today, he sat on camera and said, this is the greatest foreign policy blunder in American history. Worse than Iraq, worse than Vietnam, worse than anything. I'm going to take you through why. And then we're going to get to the part near the end about why America can't just walk away. That I think is going to sit with you for a while. Mearsheimer starts not with this war specifically, but with a question that cuts to the core of the entire strategy. Has punishment ever forced a country to surrender? Not is the blockade hurting Iran? Of course it's hurting Iran. The question is, does hurt equal surrender? He goes through a historical record, and what he finds is not encouraging.
Other than what you hear on Fox News and associated outlets, there's no evidence that what General Keane and others are saying is true. And in fact, all the evidence is that the Iranian people are standing behind the regime and that the regime is able to withstand the punishment that's been inflicted on it so far. And you want to remember that in the past, the Iranian regime has demonstrated that it is able to absorb a huge amount of punishment, both on the civilian population and on military forces, as we saw in the war between Iran and Iraq during the 1980s. So we would have to inflict much, much more punishment on the civilian population and on the military in Iran before there was any evidence, meaningful evidence, that it was going to collapse. But the more general point I would make is if you look at the historical record, when countries get into wars and one side decides to punish the other side, in other words, to inflict massive punishment on the civilian population, on the opposing side's economy, in almost every case, the target state does not quit. It does not concede. We saw this in World War II with the bombing campaigns against Japan and Germany. We saw this earlier with regard to Iran. You remember that President Trump, after he walked away from the JCPOA in 2018, this was during his first term, we then pursued a policy called maximum pressure against Iran. And we put wicked economic sanctions on the Iranians, and we did everything we could to bring them to their knees. And we did inflict massive punishment on the civilian population, but it did not work then. It's not going to work now. And in my opinion, it's not going to work in the future. We are not going to win this war with a naval blockade any more than we were going to win this war with air power. It's just not going to happen.
Maximum pressure, 2018 to 2021. Iran oil exports crashed to near zero. Currency collapsed. Inflation hit 40%. By every metric, Iran was in serious pain. Did they surrender? No. They enriched more uranium. So what Mearsheimer is saying is that what we're doing right now is a harder version of something that already didn't work. The historical record says harder punishment still won't get them to quit. So if punishment doesn't force surrender, what does? He has a very specific answer, and it leads directly into the three options Trump is being briefed on right now. But here's where Mearsheimer goes further. He doesn't just say the blockade won't work. He goes through every military option on the table, one by one, and eliminates each of them. And watching him do it is like watching someone methodically close every exit door in a room.
You're not going to be able to bring Iran to surrender unless you invade the country. This is what we had to do against Iraq. Why did we invade Iraq? We invaded Iraq because it was the only way to get them to surrender. Why did the Soviets have to go into Berlin? And why did we have to go into Germany as well in World War II and decisively defeat the Third Reich? It's because they wouldn't surrender from a punishment campaign. We don't even know where exactly that enriched uranium is. And by the way, they have 11 tons of it. They only have, about 440 kilograms of the uranium that's enriched up to 60%. But they have a lot of other uranium that's enriched up to 20%, a lot that's enriched up to 5%, 11 tons of it. It's spread all over the place, and we're not exactly sure where it is. Furthermore, don't you think the Iranians are going to anticipate that we might try to send in special forces teams and take away that enriched uranium? And therefore, don't you think they're going to have those areas well protected? Of course they are. This is not going to work. And furthermore, even if we get that enriched uranium, they can enrich more uranium. We have to get it through our thick skulls that the Iranians have the centrifuges and they have the knowledge to enrich uranium up to weapons grade material. And there's nothing we can do to eliminate that capability. Well, this third option that you described is a pipe dream. With regard to using ground forces to take the strait, you're going to need one heck of a lot of ground forces, which we don't have in the region. And furthermore, you're going to suffer significant casualties. And furthermore, even if you take the strait, you still run into the problem that you have to come into the Gulf, right? Okay, you get through the strait and you're in the Gulf. And you are then a sitting duck because the Iranians have huge numbers of drones and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles and artillery and submarines and so forth and so on that they can use against any ship that gets through the strait.
Short and powerful strikes on infrastructure targets.
I will remind viewers that we've already tried that and it didn't work. And if you get into playing that game and it then morphs into a long campaign, we all know that the Iranians have a second strike capability. And that is that they'll go to work shutting down the Red Sea and destroying infrastructure in countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and so forth and so on. And the reason we haven't been bombing in recent weeks is in large part because we understand the other side has that second strike capability. This is the point you and I have made many times. As you go up the escalation ladder, it's not us that dominates, it's them. And then my final point, Danny, is that people are now well aware that we are running out of munitions, that we have used up a huge chunk of our inventory of precious weaponry that we need for other contingencies around the world. All of this is to say, Danny, to put it very simply, we're screwed.
Notice what just happened. He went through every option on the table. Special forces, ground troops, air campaign, and eliminated each one with specific documented logic. Not emotion, not politics, logic. Option 1, grab the uranium. 11 tons spread across multiple locations, well protected, and even if we got some of it, they can make more. Option 2, ground forces take the strait. We don't have the troop numbers in the region, and even if we push through, we'd be a sitting duck inside the Gulf. Option 3, shock and awe again. We already tried this. It didn't work. If we try again, Iran shuts down the Red Sea. And under all three options, running out of munitions. We're screwed. At the end of walking through every closed door, that's where you arrive. But here's the thing I can't get past. If all three military options fail, and Mearsheimer makes a compelling case that they do, then we were never going to win this war. The decision to start it was made without a realistic endgame. That's not a miscalculation. That's something more disturbing. And it's exactly what he gets to next. But okay, maybe we can't win this war militarily. Maybe we should have known. That's one level of bad. Here's the next level. What Mearsheimer describes now isn't just about the war. It's about what this war has already done in 2 months to everything America spent 50 years building into the Gulf. And honestly, listening to this part, I had to stop and rewind.
Let's just talk about where we are today and compare that to where we were on February 27th. What we had done up to February 27th, or I should say up to February 28th, is we had built an alliance structure in the Gulf around the 6 GCC countries. And this alliance structure was mainly aimed at containing Iran. And we had a whole series of military bases in the region, naval, air, and ground forces. We, in a very important way, served as a pacifier in the region. You know, when we talk about Europe, we talk about NATO and the American military presence in Europe as a pacifier. The United States is a pacifying force in Europe. And I think if you look at the Gulf on February 27th, you see that we had this alliance structure and we had these American military bases, and we were the pacifier in the region. Furthermore, we were not only the pacifier, but again, much like Europe, we provided security for the various countries in the region. That's why they allowed our bases to be there, because we were providing security. Our security umbrella was over those 6 countries that were in this alliance that we had put together. And it all looked like a very effective alliance structure. And our relations with countries in the Gulf looked very stable. And furthermore, those countries looked like they were all flourishing as a result of being part of this American-dominated alliance. So that's where we were on February 27th. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, where are we today? Well, first of all, in terms of the bases, virtually all the bases have been either destroyed or badly damaged. It's not clear that those bases are ever going to return, or that all of them are going to return. It's not clear we're going to want to go back because they're so vulnerable. And it's not clear that the Gulf states are going to want us back, because the Gulf states now understand that those bases are giant magnets for ballistic missiles and drones coming out of Iran. So if you look at the situation with regard to bases, we are in deep trouble. If you look at the alliance structure, it seems to me that the alliance that we had put together has come apart at the seams. Just look at what's happened with regard to the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and the Saudis. They're at each other's throats. They're mortal enemies. Looks like they dislike each other more than they dislike the Iranians. And then you have to start thinking about, what about Oman? What about Qatar? Are they thinking along the lines that the UAE is thinking in terms of how to deal with Iran? The answer is absolutely no. So the alliance that we had put together and that was in place on February 27th is badly fractured, if not torn apart. The base situation, as I described, is a disaster. Then there's the whole question of us as a pacifier. Are we a pacifier? No, we're the exact opposite. We started this war. They didn't want this war. We started this war. We're not a pacifier. We set the region on fire. And furthermore, we're supposed to provide security for them. We're not only the pacifier, but we're supposed to provide security. Have we been providing security for them? No, we have not. We've been doing exactly the opposite. All of this is to say, Danny, when you look at all the dimensions of our relationship with these various countries in the GCC on February 27th, and you think about where they are on April 30th, the difference is like night and day. And all of this is to say, we really blew this one big time.
Night and day. Let me make that specific. Basis, CNN investigation published May 1st. At least 16 US military sites damaged across 8 countries, making up the majority of US positions in the Middle East. Some facilities virtually unusable. Radar systems, communications equipment, aircraft destroyed. Alliance, the UAE left OPEC. Saudi Arabia and UAE, the 2 pillars of the GCC, Mearsheimer just called mortal enemies who dislike each other more than they dislike Iran. The pacifier role, gone. And I want to sit with his word choice. He doesn't say we fell short or underperformed. He says we set the region on fire. That's not failing a goal, that's doing the opposite of the goal. The countries that hosted our bases did so because we offered security. Now they understand that hosting American military makes them a target, not a shield. A magnet for ballistic missiles. 50 years of alliance building. 2 months to destroy it. That's a civilizational own goal. So, we've destroyed the military capability and wrecked the alliances. Then Mearsheimer raises something that I think is the most underreported consequence of this entire war. Something almost nobody is naming out loud. We started this war to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And the result, Mearsheimer sees this coming, is 2 of our closest allies moving towards nuclear weapons themselves.
I'd make 3 points, Danny. First of all, there's the economic dimension, which you were just describing. It's quite clear that the worst economic consequences of this war, the Iran war, leaving aside the Gulf, of course, are taking place in Asia, East Asia and India. There's just no question about it. The South Koreans, the Japanese, the Indians, the Indonesians, the Filipinos, these people are all suffering greatly as a result of this war. They're suffering economically, that is. So that's one dimension. The second dimension is the strategic dimension. Our East Asian allies are depending us to maintain significant military forces in East Asia to protect them, and to put it in slightly different terms, to contain China. And that, of course, is why over the years we have pivoted to Asia. But the end result of the Iran war is we're pivoting away from Asia. We're taking precious military resources out of South Korea, out of Japan, and we're shipping them to the Middle East. And there in the Middle East, we're burning up those precious resources. We're using up resources that won't be available in East Asia. The third point I would make is if you look at what's happening in the war in Iran, and you just look more generally at what's happening in terms of American foreign policy and how President Trump is conducting foreign policy, I think more and more countries around the world are coming to the conclusion that you just can't trust the United States. The United States is just not a reliable ally. Number one, it might not be there for you. I mean, can you really count on Donald Trump to be there for you? I don't know. But then the second problem is, do you want to depend on this country that is run by a man whose judgment is questionable at best? I mean, when you look at what the United States is doing around the world, I know you do this and I do this, we just scratch our heads and you just sort of say to yourself, this is not the way rational legal people behave. What's going on here? When you look at these tweets that he's firing off in the middle of the night, you just sort of say to yourself, is this guy playing with a full deck? And that raises all sorts of questions about whether other countries can depend on the United States for their security. Again, there's the question of whether we'll be there for them. We're pivoting away from East Asia, as I said. But even if we are there for them, can you trust the United States? And the end result of this is the South Koreans, I think, and the Japanese, I think, are going to start to think long and hard about how to protect themselves. And that's going to push them to think about acquiring nuclear weapons.
Stop. I need this to land properly because it's easy to scroll past. We started this war to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And Mearsheimer's conclusion is that this war will push Japan and South Korea towards acquiring nuclear weapons. That is not irony. That is a catastrophic policy failure in the most literal sense possible. South Korea has already imposed driving restrictions on government employees, 5-day rotation by license plate number, and is actively weighing whether to extend those restrictions to the general public if oil hits $120 a barrel. Japan gets more than 90% of its oil from the Middle East, almost all through Hormuz. Factory output fell in March. The Bank of Japan slashed the 2026 growth forecast in half. These are among America's closest allies anywhere in the world. Countries that we've been promising to protect for 70 years. Countries we said the Pacific pivot was for. Instead, we took weapons from their region to fight someone else's war. When your security guarantor does that, you start thinking about self-reliance. And self-reliance for Japan and South Korea, surrounded by nuclear-armed neighbors, eventually points in one direction. We started this war to stop one country from getting nukes. We may end it having pushed two of our closest allies towards them. That is the consequence nobody wants to name out loud. The damage doesn't stop at Asia. Mearsheimer walks through Turkey and Russia, and then comes the most controversial thing he says in this entire conversation, about why America can't simply walk away. But first, Turkey, because this one genuinely surprised me.
Well, I'd make two quick points on this. First of all, because the Israelis have their gun sights on Turkey, relations between Israel and Turkey are deteriorating, and the Turks live in fear of the Israelis, as they should. And I was reading a story today that the Turks are racing to finish an aircraft carrier because they think this aircraft carrier, once deployed in the Mediterranean Sea, will be useful for deterring the Israelis. And furthermore, you can understand that if Turkey and Israel become mortal enemies, given that we're attached at the hip to Israel, this will create all sorts of problems for Turkey. But that's point number one. Point number two is, if you think about it, Turkey has a deep-seated interest in making sure Iran doesn't lose the war. Because if Iran loses the war, that means that the Israelis will take their gun sights off Iran, because by definition, it has been finished off, and they'll concentrate on finishing off their next adversary, which is Turkey. So I would imagine the Turks will go to some lengths, probably very quietly, to make sure that Iran survives, because it's in their strategic interests. And this basically goes to show you, I mean, we didn't talk about Israel before when we were talking about the alliance structure involving the GCC, but Israel is a huge albatross around our neck, not only because they bamboozled us into this war, but also because of the trouble they're causing in places like Lebanon, places like Syria, but now with Turkey. We have no interest in picking a fight with Turkey. We need all the friends we can get. Well, the war has worked to Russia's benefit for two reasons. One is that we have taken sanctions off of Russian oil, and they're selling their oil at a higher price in global markets, and that's helping their economy, and therefore it's helping the war effort against Ukraine. And then furthermore, given that we're expending huge numbers of boutique weapons in the war against Iran, and we need those weapons, especially for containing China, that means that the United States is going to give the Ukrainians less and less weaponry. And we're going to be interested in shutting that conflict down. And that too works to Russia's advantage.
Turkey, a NATO ally, is building an aircraft carrier to deter Israel. Let that sink in. On Russia, pure arithmetic. Higher oil prices from the blockade, Russia wins. Fewer weapons available for Ukraine, Russia wins. We handed them both advantages without them firing a shot at us. On the albatross comment, Mearsheimer uses the word bamboozled. I'll use a more precise frame. There is a documented, observable misalignment between Israeli strategic objectives and American strategic interests. Turkey is the proof. We have zero interest, zero strategic interest in making Turkey an enemy, and yet here we are. That's what happens when foreign policy decisions aren't filtered through the primary question: what serves Americans? And that brings us directly to the most important thing Mearsheimer says in this entire conversation. Can America just walk away? Can we declare it over and leave? His answer is going to bother some people. Before Mearsheimer gets to the exit question, he delivers his full verdict on the war, and he doesn't hedge bets.
I could go through this and lay out all the reasons that this is an unequivocal defeat. This is going to go down in the history books as the greatest foreign policy blunder that the United States has ever made. The Iraq War in 2003 now occupies that place in the historical record, but this one will easily supplant the Iraq War. This is a historical blunder of
Now, I would imagine that's because the Iraq War, as bad as it was, it didn't have any ramifications elsewhere. This one, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying because of the global implications it's already having. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just go back to our discussion of what we've done to the alliance structure that we had constructed in the Gulf, and then marry that to what we're talking about regarding the international economy and the fact that we're heading for the precipice. And you want to remember, at least in the Iraq War, we had some early successes so that George W. Bush could land on the carrier and declare mission accomplished. We've never even had that luxury in this war. This war is just a colossal disaster.
Greatest foreign policy blunder in the US history. Let me engage with that seriously. Iraq 2003, roughly $2 trillion, 4,431 American dead, sectarian civil war unleashed, and we accidentally handed Iran regional dominance by removing their main rival, Saddam Hussein. Regional damage, the Iran War, all of that plus a global economic shock, plus 50 years of Gulf Alliance architecture destroyed, plus East Asian allies suffering the most, plus Russia strengthened, plus Japan and Korea pushed towards nuclear weapons, plus pivoting away from the Pacific at the exact moment China is watching every move. Iraq destabilized the region. This war is destabilizing the post-World War II economic and security order. That's what easily supplant means. Not worse in degree, worse in kind. And the thing I can't shake, at least before Iraq, there was a debate. People pushed back. This time, the decision was made faster, with less deliberation, in service of objectives that Mearsheimer and Trump's own counterterrorism chief before he resigned both said were not American objectives. The speed of the decision might be the most alarming part of everything. If you can't win militarily, the alliance is already broken. The blockade won't force surrender, so what's the actual endgame? Mearsheimer has a specific answer. And then he says why we can't just leave, which is the part I've been building towards.
My argument is it's not going to work. And at some point, he's going to have to concede defeat, in large part because the damage that will be done to the European and to the American economies, and more generally to the world economy, will be so great that he has no choice. I think that's the only thing that's going to put an end to this war. The threat that the world economy is going to go off a precipice. And with that threat present, I think President Trump will then have to face reality and accept the fact that we've lost. But until then, until the economic pressure builds to the point where he feels forced to end the war, I think what he'll do is he'll stick to the blockade. Because I think that is the least bad alternative. He has no good alternative here. I like to talk about militaries having three instruments that they can use: air power, land power, and naval power. He can't use air power. He's tried it. It didn't work. And it'll backfire if he goes down that road. There's no land power option here. We just don't have enough combat troops on the ground. And even if we did, the thought of invading Iran is just out of the question. So he's left with naval power. And I don't think that's going to work. I just don't think that's in the cards. The Israelis won't let us do that.
Yeah, you have to figure that. It's not just Trump.
And the lobby here in the United States will not let us do that. uh, we're not leaving.
Mearsheimer's endgame. Blockade continues as the least bad option. Global economy deteriorates. At some point, the pain becomes so acute that Trump has no choice but to sign a deal that favors Iran and try to rebrand it as something else. On why we can't leave, the Israeli won't let us and the lobby won't let us. I want to address this directly because it's the most controversial thing in this conversation. This is not a new claim from Mearsheimer. He co-authored the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy in 2007. A peer-reviewed academic book documented how pro-Israel lobbying groups have shaped American foreign policy in ways that don't align with American national interest. You don't have to agree with his entire thesis to sit with the observable question it raises. Are the decisions being made in this war being made primarily for American reasons? Trump's own counterterrorism chief resigned and said no. That's not Mearsheimer talking. That's Trump's own appointee. When two sources that different arrive at the same conclusion, an academic who's been making this argument for 20 years and a Trump loyalist who just quit, at some point that stops being controversial and starts being a pattern worth taking seriously. Mearsheimer closes with something short. Danny says it first, Mearsheimer confirms it, and I've been thinking about it since.
We will remind them what they have done.
We will.
That's a promise, not a threat. A promise from someone who went on record before Iraq saying it was a mistake, who went on record in 2015 saying NATO expansion would lead to exactly what happened in Ukraine, who is now on record saying this is the greatest foreign policy blunder in American history. When this ends, and it will end, there will be an effort to rebrand it, to declare success, to move on without accountability. The receipts exist. They don't disappear.
We're screwed. Virtually all the bases have been either destroyed or badly damaged night and day. The South Koreans, I think, and the Japanese, I think, acquiring nuclear weapons.
Here's where I land. The military option analysis. Nothing I've seen from any serious analyst disputes this logic. 3 options, 3 dead ends, documented research for each. The alliance damage. CNN confirmed 16 bases. UAE-Saudi fracture is documented. The pacifier role is objectively gone. The economic consequences in Asia, South Korea, and Japan data backs it up completely. The pivot away from the Pacific while burning weapons in the Middle East is happening in plain sight. Russia's benefit, pure arithmetic, undisputed. I'd add nuance. The nuclear weapons trajectory for Japan and Korea is a serious risk, not a certainty. It depends heavily on how this ends and what security commitments follow. On the lobby question, I'll say what I always say. The documented record is damning enough without needing a conspiracy frame. We don't need to claim secret control. We just need to look at the pattern of decisions and ask honestly, who benefited? And was it Americans? The answers to those 2 questions is what this entire conversation is really about. Mearsheimer makes a bold historical claim. This is worse than Iraq, worse than Vietnam, worse than anything in American foreign policy history. I want to hear from people who think he's wrong. Not, I don't like Mearsheimer, that's not an argument. Tell me the specific claim in his analysis that doesn't hold up. Show me the alliance that's still intact. Show me the military option that works. Show me the endgame that doesn't end in a deal that favors Iran. Bring the argument with evidence. Comments are open. And if this conversation matters to you, share it with one person who needs to hear it. This is ARM Geopolitics. I'm Aaron Johnson. Stay sharp, stay informed, and never stop questioning. I'll see you in the next one.